The dress cost $26,000. Hand-beaded, ivory white, sewn by a seamstress in the Treme neighborhood of New Orleans over the course of 4 months. And it was paid for in secret. 7 months of hidden savings, tucked away dollar by a woman who hadn't been allowed to make a single financial decision on her own in 5 years. Serafina Delacroix chose that dress alone. Bought it alone, hid the receipt in a lockbox her fiancé didn't know existed, and that is exactly what made Calhoun Pemberton furious. But what Cal did next, what he did to that dress in the bridal suite of a chapel in the Garden District of New Orleans, in front of her mother, in front of her bridesmaids, that was the moment everything changed. Because 20 minutes after he destroyed the most important thing she owned, the doors of that chapel flew open, and a man walked in who made every single person in those pews stop breathing. A man whose name was whispered in boardrooms and feared in back rooms across the entire Gulf Coast. A man who hadn't set foot inside a church in 20 years, but drove across New Orleans in 11 minutes because he saw a live stream of a woman in a torn dress and recognized the fire in her eyes from 6 years ago. His name was Ezra Katsaros, and what he did next changed everything. If this story already has you hooked, hit that subscribe button and drop a like right now, because what happens in the next 80 minutes is something you will not forget. Now, let me take you back to the bridal suite. Back to the exact moment Serafina Delacroix looked in the mirror, touched the torn beads on her shoulder, and decided she was done being small. She was standing in the bridal room of a 200-year-old chapel in the Garden District, adjusting the beadwork along her collarbone, when she heard the footsteps. Hard. Fast. The kind of walk that belongs to a man who has already decided he is going to ruin something before he opens the door. Cal came in looking like every woman's dream. Tailored navy suit, hair swept back, jaw like it was carved from stone. But his eyes were cold. The kind of cold Serafina had learned to read over 5 years of silence and small cruelties. Her 2 bridesmaids, Odette Thibodeau and Vivienne Marchand, froze near the doorway. Her mother, Celestine Delacroix, 56 years old, sickle cell eating her joints, 2 shifts a day cleaning hotel rooms in Algiers Point, stood by the window clutching a bouquet of white gardenias with hands that hadn't stopped trembling since she arrived. Because Cal had told Serafina that crossing the river to visit her mother's neighborhood was beneath her, that Algiers wasn't the kind of place his wife should be seen. 18 months. 18 months since Celestine had been allowed near her own daughter. Everyone in that room felt the air change. You're wearing that. It wasn't a question. It was a verdict wrapped in a voice she'd heard 1,000 times before. The same voice that told her she laughed too loud at dinner parties, that her opinions embarrassed his colleagues, that her Creole was too rough for polite company, always too much of something. Never enough of something else. "It's my dress," Serafina said, keeping her voice steady even though her hands were shaking behind the folds of lace. "I chose it. I paid for it. With what money?" Cal stepped closer, circling her like she was evidence in a case he'd already won. "Who paid for this, Serafina?" "Because I know what you make, which is nothing, and this dress costs more than your mother's apartment." That's when she saw it, the thing behind his eyes that wasn't just control. It was fear, the fear of a man who realizes the woman he's been shrinking for 5 years still has a part of herself he cannot reach. He grabbed the shoulder of the dress. Serafina heard the sound before she felt it. Beads scattering across marble, fabric tearing. 7 months of secret hope ripping apart from her shoulder to her waist. And then Cal said the thing she would never forgive. "You're just like your father, always pretending to be more than you are." And look how that ended for him. The bouquet slipped from Celestine's hands. White gardenias hit the stone floor like a muffled scream. Odette lunged forward, but Vivienne grabbed her arm. And Serafina stood perfectly still, staring at her reflection in the mirror, at the torn dress, at the bruise on her wrist she'd been hiding under a bracelet for 2 weeks, at the woman she used to be. The 21-year-old who'd translated $200 million maritime contracts in 3 languages, who'd corrected senior attorneys twice her age without flinching, who'd once sat across from one of the most powerful men on the Gulf Coast and told him his contract clause was wrong. and something inside her, something that had been asleep for 5 years, opened its eyes. "No," she said. And if you think that word was the end of her story, you don't know what happened next. She didn't adjust the dress, didn't pull the fabric closed. She walked toward the door. Cal stood blocking the frame, both hands braced against either side like a wall. His voice dropped into that tone he always used when he wanted her to obey without shouting. "Think about what you're doing, Serafina. There are 230 people sitting out there. My parents, my partners, my father's colleagues. You walk out like that and you're not just embarrassing yourself. You're destroying everything we've built." Serafina stopped one step away from him. She looked straight into those cold eyes. The eyes she had once believed were calm, dependable, a place of refuge, and for the first time in 5 years, she saw them exactly for what they were. Empty. "Good," she said. And her voice did not shake. "Let them see." Behind her, a small sound broke the air, the scrape of a chair across the stone floor. Celestine Delacroix rose to her feet. She stood slowly, because her joints ached, because sickle cell had been eating away at her body for 20 years, because these legs had stood for 12 hours a day, 2 jobs. To raise 2 children alone, after her husband drowned in the Gulf of Mexico when Serafina was 13. But she stood. She walked to her daughter's side, took Serafina's hand, and spoke loudly enough for Cal to hear every word, loudly enough for Odette and Vivian, loudly enough for herself to hear the strength in her own voice after decades of keeping quiet. "Your father didn't live to walk you down this aisle, but I'm here. And I will not let anyone do this to you again." Her hand trembled, but her grip was iron. Because Celestine Delacroix had never spoken a single sentence against Cal in all 5 of those years, not because she hadn't wanted to, because Cal had cut off every path that would let her come near her daughter, and she had been terrified that if she spoke, Serafina would lose even the little contact she still had. But today, standing in that bridal suite thick with the scent of gardenias and expensive perfume, looking at the dress her daughter wore torn open by the hand of the man who was supposed to love her, Celestine decided that silence was no longer the way she would protect her child. Odette stepped forward, both fists clenched at her sides. Vivian stood beside her, quieter, but with her shoulders straight and her chin lifted. 4 women facing 1 man in a doorway. Cal looked at them, and for the first time, he understood that he was no longer dealing with a woman who stood alone. He stepped aside, not because he wanted to, but because he didn't know what to do when 4 women moved toward him at once with eyes that weren't asking permission. Serafina stepped into the corridor and turned into the main aisle of the chapel. The moment she appeared, the elderly organist in the loft looked down and his fingers stopped in the middle of a note. The wedding march died in the air, and the silence that crashed down over that chapel felt heavier than any music. 230 heads began to turn. In the front row, Judge Harlan Pemberton, in a gray 3-piece suit, and Margot Pemberton, in pale silk, sat with the posture of people accustomed to controlling every room they entered. Margot was the first to see the tear. Her mouth opened, then closed without a sound. Judge Harlan narrowed his eyes like he was reading a contract with the wrong clause. Then the second row turned. Then the third, like dominoes falling backward from the altar to the door. The right side of the chapel was full. That was Cal's world. His father's fellow attorneys, investment fund managers in expensive suits, Margot's Art Society friends in silk scarves. The left side was almost empty. A few of Serafina's former co-workers from the maritime law firm, 2 aunts from Algiers Point, and in the last row, nearly hidden behind a stone column, Thierry Delacroix sat with his face drained of color, his phone still in his hand with a message he had sent his sister 20 minutes earlier about $45,000 in gambling debt he had no idea how to repay. A message Serafina hadn't had time to read before Cal stormed in. Thierry looked at his sister walking in that torn dress, and he lowered his head, because even without knowing what had just happened, he knew that somehow her suffering had something to do with the burdens he kept piling onto her shoulders. Serafina walked slowly, not because she hesitated, Because she wanted to feel every step across that cold marble floor. She wanted to look straight into the eyes of every person staring at her without lowering her head. Celestine walked beside her, still holding her daughter's hand, her back straighter than Serafina had ever seen it. Odette and Vivienne followed behind, two figures in lavender bridesmaid dresses. The whispering began. Someone in the 5th row whispered, "What happened to the dress?" A woman in the 3rd row lifted her hand to her mouth. A man pulled out his phone and started recording. Then another phone appeared. Then another. Someone in the 7th row started a live stream, and from that moment, Serafina Delacroix's story no longer belonged to the 230 people inside the chapel. It began to belong to the whole world. She had made it halfway down the aisle when Cal burst from between the pews, having run through the side corridor, and grabbed her wrist, right over the old bruise. In exactly the way he always held her, not hard enough to be called violence, but tight enough that she knew he wasn't asking. He was ordering.
"Serafina, stop! You're making a scene! Just come back to the room!"
But before she could react, Odette placed her hand on Cal's wrist and peeled his fingers away one by one with the cold calm of someone who had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. "Touch her again," Odette said, her voice low. "And every phone in here has it on camera." Cal pulled his hand back. He looked around and saw at least 30 phones pointed at him. He stepped back, but didn't leave. Still standing there, eyes darting, calculating. Serafina stopped. She turned. Not toward Cal, toward everyone, and she spoke. She didn't shout. Her voice rose naturally through old stone, because chapels like this were built to carry a human voice. 5 years, she said. For 5 years, this man controlled every dollar I spent. He checked my bank statements. He questioned every purchase. He told me I didn't need to work, because he'd take care of me. And then he used that against me every single day, reminding me that I earned nothing, that I was nothing without him. The silence was no longer surprise. It was people holding their breath. For 18 months, Serafina went on, her voice trembling slightly but refusing to break. "He kept me from visiting my own mother. She lives 40 minutes away, across the river, and he convinced me that her neighborhood was too dangerous, that going back there meant I was going backward. 18 months my mother spent alone with her illness, while I sat in a penthouse pretending everything was fine." Celestine wiped tears with her free hand, but did not let go of Serafina's hand with the other. "He made me quit the best job I ever had, because he said it was embarrassing that his fiancée worked for another man. He made me stop speaking Creole in public because he said it made people uncomfortable. He told me my laugh was too loud, my opinions too strong, my dreams too big. Everything about me was always too much for him." She looked straight at Cal. His face was white under the candlelight, eyes searching for someone who would take his side. No one moved. Judge Harlan sat in the front row with his jaw clenched. Margot was crying. "I was going to marry you today," Serafina said, and her voice carried something heavier than anger now. It was grief. For 5 years, she would never get back. "I was going to stand at that altar and say yes, because I had forgotten what it felt like to say no. But you just reminded me." She was about to declare the wedding over, but she didn't get the chance. Because at that exact moment, the 2 heavy cypress doors at the far end of the chapel flew open with a crash that thundered through the vaulted ceiling. Noon sunlight poured in like a flood, and in the middle of that brightness, a figure appeared, standing still, tall, unhurried. As though the whole world could wait a few more seconds for him. 20 minutes before that moment, on the top floor of a glass tower on Poydras Street in the central business district of New Orleans, Ezra Katsaros was seated at the head of a long conference table with 14 men in expensive suits, waiting for him to sign a port development deal worth $280 million. Dimitrios Stavros, Ezra's bodyguard and right hand, stood in the corner as he always did, scrolling through his phone with the habit of a former military operative who never stopped watching. He passed over a live stream spreading fast, a bride in a torn dress walking down the aisle. He recognized her instantly. He lowered the phone for Ezra to see without saying a word. Because Dimitrios knew that with Ezra Katsaros, an image said more than any explanation. Ezra looked at the screen. The video shook slightly, but the woman's face was clear enough. Clear enough for him to recognize the eyes he had last seen 6 years earlier in a glass conference room on this very floor. The eyes of the 21-year-old interpreter who had dared to interrupt him in the middle of a meeting to tell him that Clause 7.3 in the French maritime contract contained a serious translation error, and that if he signed it, he would lose his right to litigate. Ezra watched for 15 more seconds. He saw the tear in the dress. He saw that she wasn't crying. Her eyes were burning. He stood up in the middle of the lead attorney's sentence. All 14 men fell silent. Because when Ezra Katsaros stood without warning, no one dared continue speaking. He said 3 words, "Get the car," and left behind 14 men, $280 million on the table, and an unsigned pen. Now he stood at the chapel doors. Gray 3-piece suit following the lines of his tall frame, the scar running along the left side of his jaw, left uncovered as always, because that scar was a map of his childhood in the bywater, and he wasn't ashamed of anything that had made him who he was. He was not in a hurry. Every step was measured. The sound of leather on 200-year-old stone echoing with the rhythm of a clock counting down. Demetrios remained outside the chapel doors, arms crossed, back to the street, scanning the sidewalk, standing guard, as if this were not a chapel, but a meeting of the highest importance. Inside, 230 people watched Ezra walk in. No one understood what was happening. But all of them understood one thing. The man who had just stepped through those doors was not a guest. He walked down the main aisle without looking left or right. His eyes stayed fixed on Serafina. And the way he looked at her, only at her, as if no one else existed, made the entire chapel understand that he had come for one person and one person only. A man in the 4th row leaned toward the man beside him and whispered, "That's Katsaros," in the kind of voice people use when speaking a name that shouldn't be spoken aloud. The name traveled from row to row. Every time it reached someone new, the reaction was the same. Backs straightening, shoulders tightening. The instinct of a small animal when a larger predator steps into the mouth of the cave. Judge Harlan recognized Ezra the moment he crossed the threshold. He'd been a lawyer in Louisiana for 40 years. He knew the name, knew which port properties belonged to that family, knew the rumors about where their money had come from before it was washed clean through shipping and restaurant chains. His hand found Margot's and gripped it. Margot whispered, "Harlan, who is that?" But Harlan didn't answer, because the answer was not something he wanted to say aloud in a chapel. Cal stood in the middle of the aisle, and when Ezra passed him, what happened was worse than any punch or threat could have been. Ezra didn't look at him, didn't turn his head, didn't slow his stride, didn't acknowledge Cal Pemberton's existence with even the smallest gesture. He walked past Cal the way a man walks past an empty chair, the way he walks past air, the way he walks past nothing, and Cal felt it. He felt the emptiness of being completely invisible to a man the entire room feared. Cal was used to hate, to anger, to resistance. Those emotions gave him power. They confirmed he mattered enough to provoke a reaction. But Ezra Katsaros's total indifference told Cal something simpler and crueler than words ever could. He was not worth noticing. Ezra stopped in front of Serafina. Less than a single step between them. She could see every detail of his face. The steel gray eyes, cold as iron but not hollow like Cal's. The scar running from beneath his left ear along his jaw, and the way he looked at her torn dress. His gaze moved slowly, carefully, along the ripped fabric, like a man reading a sentence before passing judgment. His jaw tightened. That was the only sign of the anger inside him. No clenched fists. No widened eyes. Only that hard set of his jaw until the scar pulled taut. And anyone who had ever worked for Ezra Katsaros would have known that this was when he was most dangerous, not when he raised his voice. When he was silent and his jaw locked tight, he didn't speak, didn't ask if she was all right. Instead, he lifted both hands to the collar of his gray suit, unfastened each button slowly, slid the jacket from his shoulders, and draped it over hers. The gesture was so gentle she barely felt the weight until it was already resting across her shoulders, covering the tear, covering the ripped beadwork and the skin exposed beneath it. The warmth of his body still lingered in the fabric, and she felt it spread from her shoulder down her arm. Along with the scent of cedar and leather, not the overpowering smell of cologne like Cal wore, but something deeper, quieter, like the man standing in front of her. And in that moment, the memory came back with a clarity so sharp, it felt like yesterday. 6 years earlier, a glass conference room on the top floor, 15 attorneys seated around the table. She had been the youngest interpreter in the room, and she had interrupted the man at the head of the table to say that Clause 7.3 had a serious error. 15 attorneys had stopped breathing, but the man with the scar and the gray eyes hadn't been angry. He had looked at her for 3 seconds, nodded once, and told the room, "Fix it!" It was the only time Serafina Delacroix had ever seen a powerful man who didn't feel threatened by her intelligence, but recognized it. And now, that same man was standing in front of her. Cal tore things off her. This man placed something over her. For the first time in 5 years, someone had put something on her shoulders instead of ripping it away. And the difference between those two actions nearly made her cry right where she stood. Ezra turned toward Cal, 2 steps closer. That was all it took for Cal to step back once on instinct. And the entire chapel saw the groom retreat before a man whose name he didn't even know. "You had something extraordinary," Ezra said, each word falling like a stone into still water. "And you broke it because you were too small to appreciate it." Cal opened his mouth. No sound came out. Ezra turned to the 230 guests. "My name is Ezra Katsaros, and I need you to understand something about this woman." He didn't point at Serafina. He didn't have to. 6 years ago, Serafina Delacroix walked into a conference room in my building. She was 21 years old. She was there to translate a $200 million maritime acquisition. Halfway through the meeting, she stopped the entire room to tell me that Clause 7.3 in the French version had a critical translation error. She told me, to my face, in front of 15 of my own lawyers, that if I signed that contract, I'd lose the right to litigate. She was right. That one correction saved my company. He let his gaze pass over the faces. That woman, that brilliant, fearless, extraordinary woman was made to believe by this man, and this was the first time he acknowledged Cal's existence, pressing the words with the tone people use for something stuck to the sole of a shoe, that she was nothing. Then, his voice changed. It was no longer the voice of a man telling a story. It was the voice of a man delivering a sentence. But since we're all here sharing truths today, let me share one more. He looked straight at Cal. "Your fiancé owes $780,000 to a fund that launders money for people whose names you do not want to know. He's been borrowing against a reputation he doesn't deserve for 18 months. He needed this wedding, needed her standing beside him looking respectable because his creditors were watching. This wasn't a marriage, it was a business arrangement, and she was the collateral." The chapel erupted. Cal stood in the aisle white as paper. Margot broke into tears, not for her son, but because the wedding she had spent 6 months arranging had been nothing but a shell wrapped around debt. Judge Harlan rose to his feet. "Now listen here. You can't just walk into a private ceremony and make accusations without—" He didn't finish. Ezra turned his head and looked at him. Just looked. He didn't speak, didn't threaten. And Judge Harlan Pemberton, a lawyer of 40 years who had faced federal prosecutors without flinching, sat back down. And in the silence, Serafina raised her voice. Not loud, but in that silence, it rang like a bell. "There is no wedding." 5 words. Not a question, not a request. The final judgment of a woman who for 5 years had not been allowed to decide anything. This was the first decision she had made for herself. Ezra held out his right hand, palm up. "Come with me." She looked at that hand. She knew taking it meant stepping into another world. A world of black cars and bodyguards and a name that made judges sit down. But this hand had placed a jacket over her shoulders. The other hand had torn her dress. So she took it, firm but not crushing, holding but not trapping, and that difference, small enough to be invisible, she felt more clearly than anything she had felt in 5 years. They walked toward the doors, Celestine behind them, Odette and Vivian following. And then the first applause broke out. From the 7th row on the left, A woman around 60 from Algiers Point stood and clapped with tears in her eyes. Then another woman stood. Then another, one by one, like candles being lit in the dark. Not everyone. The Pemberton side sat frozen, but enough people stood, especially women. Women who watched Serafina walk away in a torn dress, with a man's jacket over her shoulders, and saw something they recognized. Something they too had maybe endured, but had never found the courage to say no. At the threshold, Serafina turned back one last time. "I'm sorry there's no wedding. But I think you just witnessed something more important. You witnessed a woman choosing herself. She stepped into the sun. Cal came charging out after them. Demetrios simply turned and looked at him. One look from the eyes of a former military operative. Cal stopped cold. The car pulled away. Through the rear window, Serafina watched Cal standing alone on the steps, growing smaller until he vanished. Inside the car, silence. The kind of silence Serafina hadn't heard in 5 years. She let out a breath from somewhere she hadn't even realized she'd been holding. For the first time in 5 years, she sat in a space where no one was judging her. Celestine sat gripping her daughter's hand, but her eyes were on Ezra. The eyes of a woman who had spent 56 years learning that no one helps for free, grateful, but not trusting, not yet. The car stopped at Tante Rosalie's on Dauphine Street in the Marigny, a tiny Creole restaurant with 40 years of roux and gumbo soaked into the brick walls. Rosalie Fontenot, 72, had been cooking for Ezra since he was 12, a boy who lost his mother in the Bywater. She saw Serafina step in wearing a torn dress, and didn't ask a single question. She wrapped her in an embrace, draped her own hand-knitted shawl over her shoulders, and led her to the quietest corner. 5 minutes later, 3 steaming bowls of chicken and andouille gumbo appeared. Then, Rosalie closed the kitchen door, giving them space. Serafina looked at the gumbo. The scent of thyme and file powder reached her, and the wall she had built over 5 years to keep everything from breaking apart collapsed. She cried. Not softly, not beautifully, like in the movies. With her whole body, shoulders shaking, hands gripping the edge of the worn table, tears falling onto the torn beadwork of her dress. The sound that came out of her was the sound of 5 years bursting loose all at once. She cried because her father drowned when she was 13, and there was no one to walk her down the aisle. She cried because her mother had sickle cell and she hadn't been allowed to visit for 18 months. She cried because Thierry, her younger brother, was drowning in gambling debt and she didn't know how to save him. She cried because she had given up the best job of her life for a man who told her she didn't need to work. She cried because 20 minutes earlier she had almost married a man who saw her as collateral for a $780,000 loan. Celestine held her daughter from the left side, saying nothing, just letting Serafina cry into her shoulder, her hand rubbing slow circles against her back. The same way she had when Serafina was a girl of 13 standing beside her father's coffin in a funeral home in Algiers Point. Ezra sat across from them. He did not touch her, did not say everything would be okay, did not try to comfort her, did not do anything except sit there, silent, patient, giving her space to fall apart without anyone trying to clean up the pieces right away. And that silence, that undemanding presence, was the only right thing anyone could have given Serafina in that moment. She cried until there was nothing left to cry. Her body stopped before her mind did. Her breathing slowed. She sat up with swollen eyes and picked up her spoon. Her hand still trembled, but she dipped it into the gumbo and took a mouthful. The warm broth slid down her throat, and she felt the warmth spread through her chest as if her body had forgotten what it felt like to be nourished. She ate a few more spoonfuls in silence, then set the spoon down. "Why did you come?" she asked. Her voice was rough from crying, but the question was direct. Because Serafina Delacroix, even after being made smaller for 5 years, was still the woman who had corrected a $200 million contract in front of 15 lawyers. And she didn't ask questions unless she wanted the real answer. Because 6 years ago you corrected me in front of my own lawyers. No one does that. Not to me. Not in my own building. You were 21 and you didn't flinch. He paused. Today, someone was trying to kill that version of you. And I wasn't going to sit in a conference room and watch it happen on a phone screen. Celestine set down her spoon and looked straight at Ezra. What do you want from my daughter, Mr. Katsaros? Right now? Nothing. I came because it was the right thing to do. I've survived 40 years by knowing which help to accept and which to refuse. I raised 2 children alone after my husband drowned on a Tuesday afternoon. I know what it looks like when a man offers something for free, and I know what it costs later. She paused. I haven't decided about yours yet, Mr. Katsaros. Ezra nodded once, didn't argue. He respected her answer in a way Cal had never respected any answer that wasn't the one he wanted. The car stopped in front of Serafina's apartment building in the Bywater. Demetrios opened the door for mother and daughter. Ezra did not get out, did not follow them upstairs, did not say, I'll call you, or make any kind of promise at all. He only said, Take care, Serafina, through the open door. She nodded once, then walked into the building with her mother beside her, her torn dress trailing over the concrete steps, Rosalie's wool shawl over her shoulders. And for the first time in 5 years, no one followed her up the stairs to check whether she had locked the door. 3 days after the wedding that never happened, the videos exploded across every platform. Millions of views. The title that spread fastest was Shipping Tycoon Crashes Wedding to Save Bride. Reporters camped outside her building. Serafina didn't leave. Celestine became a wall between her daughter and the world. Then, on the second day, an envelope arrived from Judge Harlan's law firm, a letter threatening to sue Serafina for defamation. The same method of control, in a different form. Then Thierry called at 2 a.m, voice shaking. $45,000 owed to online betting apps, collectors at his door. 2 weeks. He didn't say 2 weeks for what. Both siblings understood. Serafina sat in the dark apartment. No job, no income, no lawyer. Threatening letter on the table. Brother in danger. Reporters outside. She had traded one chaos for another. On the 3rd day, Ezra arrived with food from Rosalie's and a white envelope. Inside, proof that Thierry's debt was paid in full, and a Katsaros Holdings business card with a handwritten note, Director of International Maritime Translations, position open, no expiration date. What appeared in Serafina's eyes was not gratitude. It was anger. I don't take charity, she said, each word a brick in a wall. I didn't ask you to pay my brother's debt. I didn't ask you for a job. I didn't ask you for anything. It's not charity, it's an investment. I invest in people worth investing in. You don't know me. You saw me once 6 years ago, and somehow that's enough for you to walk into my wedding, pay my brother's debt, and offer me a job? That's not how the real world works. Ezra's voice dropped so low that Celestine had to step closer. 2 years ago, your brother owed $60,000 to a group operating out of Gretna. They're not the kind who send letters. They show up. I paid it. Not because I knew your brother, because I knew that if they came for him, sooner or later they'd find you. And I wasn't going to let that happen. Serafina went still. She hadn't known about that debt. Thierry had never told her. 2 years. Ezra had known about her before the wedding, before the video, before everything. You've been watching me, she said. Not a question. I've been making sure no one else was. Serafina stood, walked to the door, pulled it open. Thank you for the food. Thank you for the chapel. Thank you for my brother's debt. But I need you to leave, because I can't think clearly while you're telling me you've been in my life without my knowledge for 2 years. And I need time to decide whether that makes you different from Cal or exactly the same. Ezra stood without hurry, nodded once, and before she closed the door he said, the job offer doesn't expire. Neither does the debt clearance. Whether you ever speak to me again or not, those are done. The door shut. Serafina stood with her back against it, both hands clenched. Celestine watched from the kitchen and said nothing, because she understood that what her daughter needed was not advice. It was space. That night, Serafina lay staring at the ceiling. She thought about everything. Thierry's $60,000 debt she never knew about. The new $45,000, now erased. The business card on the table. The threatening letter. No job. No income. No lawyer. She picked up her phone. found the number Demetrios had left for emergencies, called. 2 rings. Then Ezra answered. "I'll take the job," Serafina said, calm. "Clear. But I have conditions. I pay my own rent. I choose my own hours. I report to you on work, and work only. And if I ever find out you're making decisions about my life behind my back again, about my brother, my family, anything, I walk. No conversation, no second chance. I walk." 3 seconds of silence. Then Ezra's voice came through, and she could have sworn she heard something close to a smile in it. "I'd be disappointed if you didn't." That Monday, Serafina walked into Katsaros Holdings on Poydras Street. White blouse, black trousers, flats, the only professional outfit she owned after 5 years of wearing only what Cal chose. She crossed the lobby, past reception where employees stared because they'd seen the video, and took the elevator to the top floor. When the doors opened, she saw it. A corner office at the end of the hall, glass door, and on it a metal plaque engraved with her name, Serafina Delacroix, Director of International Maritime Translations. Not a temporary sign, etched into metal, fastened with screws. The kind ordered at least a week before she ever said yes. Part of her was touched, part of her uneasy, because his certainty felt dangerously close to the way Cal once arranged her life without asking. But she walked in. Over the next 3 months, she proved the plaque was truth, not favoritism. In the 3rd week, she caught a translation error the legal team had missed, saving a $70 million deal with a shipping partner in Marseille. In the 2nd month, she closed her first deal by calling a French partner directly, negotiating in French, and signing in French. The partner told his assistant it was the first time in 20 years an American company had respected them in their own language. In the 3rd month, she closed a 2nd deal and started getting invited into senior meetings. Not as an interpreter, but as an advisor. The relationship between Serafina and Ezra grew not through grand gestures, but through small details she only noticed over time. Every morning a hot café au lait appeared on her desk, exactly how she drank it, even though she'd never told anyone. One night she worked late until nearly 11, looked through the glass wall, and saw Ezra standing at the far end of the dark corridor. He didn't walk in, didn't knock. Their eyes met across 20 yards of glass and silence. He nodded once and turned away. And Serafina sat there with her heart beating faster than she wanted to admit. In the 6th week, a strange car followed her from the streetcar stop to her apartment. She texted Ezra. 10 minutes later, 3 black SUVs appeared outside her building. Demetrios stepped out of the first one. The car vanished. Next morning, Ezra stood in her office doorway and said 4 words, "It won't happen again." Then he left. And Serafina realized something that took a long time to accept. Ezra had 100 times Cal's power, but he didn't use it to control her. In meetings, he asked for her opinion in front of 14 powerful men, then listened and acted on it. When she proposed changing the approach to European partners, he said, "Do it your way," and gave her full authority. When she failed, when a deal in Mobile fell apart, he didn't criticize. He asked, "What did you learn?" and moved her forward. For the first time, Serafina was experiencing something she had never believed was real. Power that existed without shrinking anyone. And the strongest man she had ever known was the only one who never once asked her to become smaller. In the 4th month, Thierry called Celestine at 2 a.m, underground poker room in Metairie. $120,000 deep, the same spiral. When Serafina found out at work, she cried silently at her desk. The practiced, hidden crying of a woman trained to never break down where anyone could see. She didn't hear the office door open. When she looked up, Ezra was already seated in the chair across from her desk. The first time he'd sat down in her office. For 4 months he had stayed in the doorway, respecting the distance she had set. Now he crossed the threshold, because this moment required it. "Thierry?" he asked. She nodded. "How much?" 120,000. Then Ezra spoke, and his voice was different. The voice of a man choosing to tell the truth even though he knew it might change everything. "Serafina, I need to tell you something. I've known about you for 6 years. Not just from the conference room. After that meeting, I had my people find out who you were. I knew when you left your job. I knew when you moved in with Cal. I knew when you stopped working, stopped translating, stopped appearing. I watched your career disappear, and I told myself it wasn't my business. But I also told myself that if you ever needed help, I'd be there. Not because you owed me anything, because that day in the conference room, you showed me something I don't see very often: courage. And I wasn't going to let the world lose that. Serafina wiped tears. Am I a project to you? Is that what this is? You saw something broken 6 years ago and you've been waiting to fix it? Ezra stood, walked to the window, his back to her, and she saw the slight tension in his shoulders. The first small crack she had ever seen. Not a project, he said, his voice low. A promise I made to myself. And in the silence between them, she felt something shift. Something changing from gratitude into something deeper. Something she wasn't ready to name, but couldn't pretend not to feel. 6 months after she walked into Katsaros Holdings, Serafina was appointed Director of International Operations. She'd closed 5 deals, built a team of 7, become the first person foreign partners called. And Dimitrios Stavros, the quietest man in the building, told a colleague, "She's the only person I've seen him smile at in 6 years." 4 months after the wedding, Cal showed up at Katsaros Holdings. No appointment. He'd lost everything. The fund fired him when the video spread. The $780,000 debt had no one to underwrite it. Judge Harlan had separated from Margot. The Pemberton family had collapsed. Cal was thinner. Shadows under his eyes, cheap wrinkled suit. He looked at Serafina in her office, composed, bright-eyed, and something in his face cracked. "So you're his woman now?" Bitter. But thin. The voice of a man who'd lost too much for cruelty. Serafina looked at the man she had once loved. "I'm my own." That's something you never understood. Then desperation. I know what Katsaros is. The money. The connections. Sign the NDA, or I go to the FBI. The conference room door swung open. No one knocked. Ezra walked in. Those gray eyes that Serafina had spent 6 months learning to read showed something that made her stop breathing. Controlled danger. The kind of calm Dimitrios once described. When he's quiet, everyone should be afraid. Ezra stopped a step from Cal, half a head taller. 10 seconds of silence, in which Cal didn't breathe, didn't move, didn't blink. Walk out of this building, never contact her again, never mention my name. In return, I will forget that you exist. That is the most generous offer you will ever receive. Take it. Cal looked at Ezra, at Serafina, back at Ezra. Then he stood and walked out, with the slumped shoulders of a man who'd lost everything and knew it. 2 people remained in the room. "Are you going to hurt him?" Serafina asked. Gray eyes met brown across the glass table. Complete honesty. Do you want me to? Not rhetorical. He was placing that decision in her hands. A decision that for a man like Ezra Katsaros would require only a single word. No, then no. He walked out, and Serafina understood something that would take her a long time to fully grasp. Cal spent 5 years controlling every decision she made. Ezra had just given her control over one of his and accepted her answer without asking twice. That difference said everything words never could. 1 year after the wedding that never happened, on Serafina's 28th birthday, Tante Rosalie's closed early for 6 people. Rosalie made the same gumbo from that first day, not out of sadness, because it had become the dish that marked a beginning. Celestine arrived with sweet potato cake from a Haitian grandmother's recipe. 28 candles. Her hands still ached, but her eyes were brighter. Over the past year, she'd been allowed back into her daughter's life. Nightly calls, weekend visits. All the small things Cal had stolen returned. Odette brought cheap sparkling wine because expensive wine was for people who didn't know how to enjoy themselves. Vivian brought flowers. Thierry walked in looking different. Not his clothes, his eyes. He worked as a prep cook at a Katsaros restaurant in the warehouse district. Gamblers Anonymous every Tuesday and Thursday. 8 months clean. He hugged his sister longer than usual and said nothing. Apologies had been said enough. Now was time for action. Ezra arrived last with aged Bordeaux. It sat beside Odette's cheap sparkling wine. And the contrast between those two bottles captured everything about the group. Entirely different people at the same table, because they all loved one woman. Celestine raised her glass. 1 year since my daughter chose herself. Glasses touched. Odette took a sip, then said with that grin only she could wear, both defiant and tender, and scared the hell out of 230 rich people doing it. The whole table laughed, even Ezra. And Serafina saw that smile on his face. Rare, brief, but real. And she remembered what Demetrios had said. The only person I've seen him smile at in 6 years. Serafina looked around the table. Her mother, her brother, her 2 closest friends, the 72-year-old woman carrying gumbo from the kitchen. And the man sitting across from her, pouring aged Bordeaux into Celestine's glass with more care than she had ever seen him give any multi-million-dollar contract. "A year ago," Serafina said, "I thought my life was over. 27, no job, no money, sitting in a dark apartment with a torn dress on the floor. Now I have work I'm proud of. Freedom I earned, every single one of you, and I have myself back." The dress hung preserved in a glass case in her apartment, paid for with her own salary. The dress was damaged, and others. The dress was damaged. The dress was damaged. But we don't have to be defined by what happens to us. We can be defined by what we do after. Rosalie set down extra napkins without a word. That night, Ezra drove Serafina home. They didn't talk. The city moved past. The Mississippi caught moonlight. The car stopped in the bywater. A yellow streetlight washed half of Ezra's face, half light, half shadow. Serafina thought that suited him, because Ezra Katsaros had always existed on the border between 2 worlds. "You never asked me for anything," she said. "In 1 year you gave me a job, protected my brother, stood in a chapel for me, sat with me while I cried, let me yell at you. Let me set every rule. And you never once asked for anything in return." His hands stayed on the wheel, eyes forward. "Because the last man who had you asked for everything. He asked you to give up your career, your language, your mother, your voice. He asked you to become smaller every single day until there was almost nothing left." His finger tapped the wheel once. The only small habit she'd learned to recognize. "I wanted to be different from that. I wanted to be the one who gave you the choice to give nothing or everything on your terms. Not mine." She opened the door, put one foot on the sidewalk, stopped, turned back, and for the first time in a year, she looked straight into Ezra Katsaros's eyes, without searching for hidden motives, without guarding herself, without comparing him to Cal. Simply looking at him. "Good night, Ezra." Those 2 words carried something more than a farewell. They carried the promise that there would be more evenings, more conversations, more silences in the car. Both of them heard it, even though neither said it aloud. "Good night, Serafina." The corner of his mouth lifted, not a smile, the shadow of one. But from Ezra Katsaros, that was already a great deal. She closed the door, went inside, climbed the stairs, unlocked the apartment she paid for with her own salary, switched on the light, and stood there looking at the wedding dress in its glass case, the tear from shoulder to waist still there, the ivory beadwork still ripped, 7 months of savings and $26,000 of dreams ruined in 3 seconds. But it was beautiful, beautiful because it was real, because it was proof that she had stood up, walked away, and said no. Down on the street, the black car still hadn't pulled away. Ezra Katsaros sat behind the wheel with the engine off, his eyes lifted toward the one lit window. He sat there for 3 minutes. 3 minutes in which the man who controlled an empire stretching from Poydras Street to the ports of the Gulf Coast, the man whose name was whispered in boardrooms and feared behind closed doors, sat alone in the dark, looking up at one lit window in the bywater, and wondered whether the most dangerous thing he had ever done in his life wasn't the multi-million-dollar deals, wasn't the confrontations with enemies, wasn't any of the things the outside world feared him for, but allowing himself to care about a woman in a torn dress who had looked him in the eye 6 years earlier and told him he was wrong. 3 minutes later, he started the engine. And the car slipped quietly away from the Bywater Street into the current of the New Orleans night. Serafina Delacroix's story was not a fairy tale. There was no prince on a white horse, no magic, no perfectly packaged ending. There was a woman pushed to the bottom who stood up on her own. There was a mother who stayed silent for years and then spoke at the exact moment her daughter needed her most. There was a dangerous man who chose to use his power to lift someone up instead of pressing someone down. And there was a torn dress hanging on the wall of a Bywater apartment, reminding anyone who looked at it that dignity is never destroyed by someone else unless we allow it to be. The lesson is simple, but many people spend a lifetime learning it. Real love never asks you to become smaller. Real power doesn't need to control anyone. And it is never too late to choose yourself. If this story touched something inside you, write one word in the comments: freedom, so I know you heard it. If it made you think of someone, a friend, a sister, a mother, or even your own self from years ago, press share so this story can reach the person who needs to hear it most. Please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you can hear more stories like this one. I want to hear from you. Which moment moved you the most? The moment the dress was torn? The moment Serafina walked down that aisle? Or the moment Ezra placed his jacket over her shoulders without saying a word? And in your own life, have you ever had to choose yourself, even when it meant walking away from what was familiar? Tell me in the comments, because every one of your stories matters. Thank you for being here today. I wish you and the people you love good health, peace, and the strength to always choose yourselves. I'll see you in the next one.